Webster was pulling open the boards that led to the above ground. As the first one pulled free, he was met with an unwelcome surprise.
Damn it. Of all the shitty luck.
Past Webster was a bit of cold that slapped Keith in the face. He knew immediately what caused Webster to throw the board down in frustration. Snow. Even to a novice like Keith, he understood the danger of recent snowfall. The snow would leave an easy trail for their pursuers, as well as destroy their cover of darkness. A man crossing a deserted street would be no more difficult a target than the 10 ducks in the shooting gallery. Webster turned from the entrance and crouched down on the ramp, even in the dim light of the flashlight. His frown and anguish were visible on his face. In his silence, he lit up a cigarette, letting in the smoke and blowing it out. From what Keith could see, the cigarette only had a few puffs remaining. Likely, it had been rationed due to the unavailability of tobacco. Keith shifted the weight of the pack strapped to his back. It was heavy, filled with dynamite, and made him feel like a walking bomb. The fire between Webster's fingers made Keith take a sudden step back. Everyone else just stood in silence. While there was no official leader of the group, Keith understood that they looked towards Webster for that role.
We'll put it to a vote. Those in favor of striking tonight, despite the snow, say aye.
At the entrance stood 7, ready to go on the mission. Keith only knew Angela, Webster, and Rinehart. The one thing this group wasn't was talkers, as they all just exchanged looks with each other in silence.
It has to be tonight as planned. We don't know how long before the snow will melt. We can't let the weather stop us. We'll have to take our chances.
It could mean suicide.
And it will definitely prove their suspicions that we hide in the subway system. Any other night would not have the significance of tonight.
Angela had briefly mentioned to Keith, prior to leaving, what was going on. She informed him of the Lexington Avenue Armory, which was converted into a military barracks for soldiers and street guards, assigned to Manhattan's Lower East Side. That was their intended target. However, a barracks was only one small part of the overall event planned, as there were other subterranean groups doing similar missions today, such as the Park Avenue Armory on the Upper East Side. Sympathizers that lived above ground were also instructed to set fire to public buildings. Since today was a holiday, and the strikes were planned to take place at night, damage to innocent lives could be averted, as there would be no workers. The entire demonstration had been carefully planned for tonight, the 1st of October, the anniversary of the inauguration of the First Lady President of the United States.
Agreed. If we're gutless tonight, and others aren't, the impact of our attack will be nothing.
The sight of Rinehart had sent a shiver down Keith's spine. After Webster had woken him and Angela, he couldn't help but notice this man watching him with great interest. He thought to ask Angela about it, but given that Keith was one who injured him, he thought it was best left alone. Even now, he was an evil-looking bastard with a perpetual sneer. Of the men here, Keith couldn't help but think that he was a poor selection. He was the most frail of the men, and beyond the sight of impairment. Could they really trust that he wouldn't hold a grudge? Webster breathed in the last of his cigarette before tossing it to the floor and crushing it out with the heel of his boot.
All right, it's tonight as planned. Everyone here knows their assignment, with the exception of Keith.
He took a step towards Keith.
We'll plant charges at 5 points of the building. The only guards are the front entrance. Angela and Maureen have the responsibility of the front corners. If they're spotted and challenged, they have prepared excuses for late night traveling. As I'm sure you're aware, there's no curfew for women, giving no reason for the guards to hold them. Both women will carry their own dynamite. They will plant the charges and return to the subway. Rinehart is our demolitions expert. He'll plant the heavy charges at the center and the rear of the armory.
And I'm to be his pack mule.
Webster nodded his shadowy head.
The remainder of us will take up positions to cover your retreat.
3 rifles against an armory of soldiers isn't very reassuring.
For Keith, though, it was not the odds that worried him, his being alone with Rinehart.
We're hoping this can be carried off without firing a shot.
Webster turned and walked towards Rinehart. The two began conversing in hushed tones. Keith was aware of Angela moving up to his side.
Are you scared?
Keith wanted to lie and be as confident as Webster was. He thought of telling her about his concern over Rinehart, but again dismissed it. The Subterraneans obviously chose men for the jobs according to their ability. Rinehart was the demolitions expert, and Keith was the strongest of the remaining males. It was only natural that he become the pack mule. Personalities were not considered, only the mission's purpose.
Have courage.
Angela squeezed his arm before moving into position in front of the subway exit. As he watched her silhouetted against the whiteness of the snow, he realized that the purse dangling heavily from her right hand contained dynamite. He felt a sudden concern for her safety. He grew up being taught that while women could do anything a man could do, it was a man's duty to stand in the face of harm for the benefit of women. He wanted to go to her and tell her to stay behind. At the same time, he was intimidated by her. Not because she was a strong woman, but that disagreeing with the female was almost as bad as a crime as he committed. One could lose their livelihood because of it. He knew she and the others here were not like the feminists up above. More than that, so few women would actually face a danger such as this, and here she was, ready to face danger. She was far braver than most men he ever knew.
It's time.
Webster moved to the exit and motioned his 2 men through.
Give us 10 minutes.
Webster went through the entrance and disappeared from sight. Keith moved up behind Angela and Maureen, leaving Rinehart in the darkness behind them. He peered through the opening and saw the snow was falling heavily in large flakes. The only time he could bear the sight of New York City was after a snowstorm. The sidewalks were then coated with a purifying white blanket, concealing most of the dirt and filth, and even the barren trees did not appear so blatantly naked, with snow collected on their branches. Angela's head was cocked to one side, as if she was waiting for some dreaded sound from the streets above. After a few moments, she relaxed noticeably. He imagined that he could hear the beating of her heart above his own, and he wanted to take her hand, but the sound of Rinehart moving up behind them stopped him.
They've made it. Women next.
By the inflection of his voice, Keith knew that Rinehart considered himself the leader in Webster's absence. The two women moved through the narrow opening of the planks, with Angela being last to step through. Right before she moved her other leg through, she turned back to face Keith.
Good luck.
With that, she went outside and disappeared up the steps. Now Keith waited with Rinehart.
It's good it snows heavy. And there's no wind. Wind would only be another strike against us.
There's more than 3 already.
Rinehart did not question his senseless statement. Keith decided that was probably a good thing, and he shouldn't talk any more than necessary with Rinehart. He could only imagine that his speaking would antagonize him. His legs ached, and he wanted to shift his position, to move away from the man at his side. He smelled of cooked onions laced with tobacco in a sweat lodge. It was hard to imagine how long since he had a bath.
Let's go. Stay close behind me, and when asked for dynamite, hand it to me with the fuse backward. I'll have no time to check it.
Keith followed behind Rinehart as he stepped through the narrow opening. Rinehart immediately ascended the stairs, and when his head became level with the street, he shielded his eyes with his hands against the snow. He stopped himself and quickly looked around in all directions before planting his foot on the top step. Keith also shielded his eyes from the snow as he went up the steps. The armory was separated from the abandoned subway exit by the deserted street. The Gothic brick building stood like an indestructible fortress that covered the entire block. Even in the white purity of the snow, it was depressing to look at. Keith wondered, in the time before female rule, if this building had ever been beautiful, or did it always appear so dreadful? Rinehart ran quickly in a hunched position, with Keith stuck to his heels as best as he could. Rinehart slowed his pace as he neared the middle of the block. Moving close to the building, he began to drag one foot, scraping the snow away from the surface of the sidewalk, until it lodged against a thin ridge. Then he dropped to his knees, and using his hands, he began frantically pushing the snow away. Keith stood behind him aimlessly, not knowing what he was searching for, until he uncovered a metal strip with a padlock attached.
Thank God women are true to form. The doors are rotten and ready to collapse.
Removing a metal pipe from the inside of his jacket, he wedged one end under the hinges and bore down with all of his weight. There was a snapping sound as the metal tore away from its hinges. Keith glanced along the street nervously, expecting to see street guards suddenly rushing towards them. With the pack of dynamite on his back, he doubted his success with a second attempt at flight. One bullet properly placed, and there would not be enough of him to identify as human. Much to his relief, the streets remained deserted. Rinehart lifted the door.
Inside, quickly!
Clinging to the frame, Keith lowered himself into the black pit. It wasn't until his feet had settled onto solid concrete that he realized there had been a metal ladder on the side. He watched as Rinehart climbed down the ladder and closed the door above his head. The pit was no more than 6 feet and a couple of inches deep, judging from the small space above his head. Rinehart struck a match, and the glow illuminated the pit, revealing a passageway that ran several feet under the building until it stopped before another door. The older man moved forward, running his hand along the wall. He suddenly stopped, to which Keith saw what appeared to be a crack, but was unsure as the match flickered and died. Keith heard him dropping to his knees and scooped up dirt and bits of concrete from the crack with the tip of the metal pipe. Debris struck the floor with what seemed an unnecessary loudness. Either there were no soldiers beyond the door, or they slept too soundly to be awakened. Keith knew that Rinehart would be wanting dynamite, so he pulled off his pack and set it down before him. He fumbled around, trying to feel the shape of the explosives in the complete darkness. The sticks of dynamite had been tied to the groups of 6. He remembered one group, made sure the fuse was facing towards him, and waited for Rinehart to demand it. Rinehart didn't even ask for it. He simply grabbed it from his hands like he could see clearly in the dark. Keith heard more scraping sounds, to which Keith assumed he was packing the charge into the crack, followed by using the debris to pack it in. Another match flared, and Rinehart touched it to the end of the long fuse.
It's crude, but it'll suffice.
He hurried Keith back along the passage where they had entered.
You've seen what I've done. Can you do the same on the opposite side of the building?
Keith hadn't seen exactly what he had done, but he didn't really want to piss off Rinehart. He simply nodded in response.
Good. It will allow us more time. I'll plant the charges at the rear while you're getting the other side ready for me.
Rinehart climbed the metal ladder. At the top, he pushed the door open slightly and glanced around. The light and snow poured in as he pushed the door wide open and climbed onto the sidewalk. Keith went up the ladder after Rinehart. The moment Keith was on the sidewalk, Rinehart grabbed him and turned him around. He felt Rinehart grab dynamite from his bag, likely 2 bundles as far as Keith could estimate. He then dropped his metal pipe next to Keith's feet and walked off. Something felt unsettling for Keith. It seemed rather sinister for the old man to decide for them to separate, as there was no previous mention of that. More than that, Rinehart had many opportunities before this to let him know how to plant explosives. He wondered if this was Rinehart's retaliation, to leave him to die in the passageway as the explosives went off. Keith pushed that thought away. He was letting paranoia get the better of him. This was a logical plan. The 2 of them working individually would increase their chances of getting away from the building long before the explosion. Just because Rinehart wasn't pleasant to look at didn't mean his intentions were bad. Keith ran off to the other side of the building as Rinehart ordered. Once he got there, he did the same as Rinehart with his foot, scraping along the sidewalk. It took him longer than Rinehart to find the doors, but once he found them, he dug it out and saw that these doors were even more corroded than the first set. Using the pipe Rinehart gave him, he was able to pry the doors apart with minimum effort. He had difficulty getting to the ladder, eventually realizing there was no ladder. He had to lower himself down like before. He didn't exactly have a light source to see the passageway, and instead felt along the walls for a crack. There were a few minor cracks, but as he searched more, he found one that would serve their purpose. Taking the pipe once more, he dug into the crack, causing debris to fall. As it did so, he realized he didn't close the doors behind him, and wondered if anyone outside could hear him. He decided that it didn't matter, and stuffed one of the bundles in the crack. As he packed the charge in, as he sort of saw Rinehart do in the first passageway, he heard someone drop in. Keith turned to see a dark figure at the entrance. Keith remained frozen with his hands on the wall as the figure moved towards him. The figure, stopping inches from him, lit a match, and to Keith's relief, the light revealed Rinehart's face. Keith's relief vanished as his eyes focused on the man's one hateful eye. Rinehart looked at the charge.
Good enough.
Keith imagined that was the best compliment he'd likely get from Rinehart.
Now get the hell out of here.
Keith turned and moved back along the passage. The doors were still open, giving a light at the end of the tunnel that was very welcoming. He grabbed onto the doorframe to pull himself up, but try as he might, he couldn't. It was this reason that he worked in the Hall of Records, and not farming or construction, as other males from the orphanage were sent off to do. He dropped down, and suddenly felt Rinehart behind him. He turned to him, seeing not his hate-filled eye, but his sinister smile as Rinehart grabbed him and threw him head first against the wall. That smile was enough for Keith to instinctively raise his hands, and though his head hit something, it was more his hands than the wall. Still, he lay on the concrete floor, dazed by the impact.
See you in hell, boy.
From what Keith could see, Rinehart sprang upward through the opening, like a youth half his age.